you're about to experience a new way to thrive in martial arts by exploring who you are, what you love, and standing up for what you believe in. It's time to rise, because this is where we challenge and say no to outdated industry norms and say yes to change, so that we create a healthier, happier, and thriving martial arts community. I'm your host, Laurien Tsuhake. Welcome to the Rise to Thrive podcast. Welcome to today's podcast episode. This time it is a special one, as we will be learning lots about the interplay between poetry, jiu-jitsu, and the constraints-led approach. Oftentimes we learn so much more about what we are doing by learning about something else. When we make that what is familiar strange, and that's what strange familiar, it's actually where growth happens. The lovely person with whom I am having this fascinating conversation is none other than Skool Rios, she, her. She's the author of Ghost of My Ghosts, written in 2024. Skool has published poems in Bleating and New Words Press as part of the Citizen Trench project, and was a nominee for the Monarch Queer Literary Award in 2025. Rios teaches an approach to poetry based on ecological dynamics and uses a constraints-led approach in order to acquire, develop, and maintain skill in writing and poetry. She trains under Greg Souders at Standard Jiujitsu in Rockville and is a grappling instructor for Queer Fight Club DMV. Welcome, Skool, to the Rise to Thrive podcast. I'm so stoked to have you here because I think we will be covering many interesting topics that are maybe sometimes taboo or often not even fully explored. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me here. My name is Skool. I'm a jiu-jitsu practitioner at Standard Jiujitsu in Rockville. I've been training since 2014, and I'm a poet as well. So I'm excited to get into this conversation and see where things go.
Did you always start at Standard, or I'm very curious on how you ended up there? And obviously, you mentioned before we recorded the interplay between jiu-jitsu and being a poet. So I would really love for you to dive into that.
Absolutely. I found my way back to Standard around like 2021. And that was where I started training there consistently. I had dropped in a couple of years earlier. I want to say around like 2016. I had a couple of classes there. I met Greg and everything, and we had some great conversations. And I was a very different jiu-jitsu practitioner then. I started at some other schools and was mainly a gi player. And it's very interesting to have found Standard around that time, because I think that was when that was around the time CLA was being implemented fully at the gym. And I went into it completely blind. I didn't even realize that was what they were doing. I just knew I had dropped into that school before, and that they had, a great way about going about learning. And so I just trusted that it was going to be a great class. And I even brought a gi my first day, and then I realized it was just completely no gi. And so it was fun to approach it from that perspective, to go into it completely blind, and then to kind of start to learn what the constraints-led approach was, and how that aligned with my learning. And what was your question about poetry again? I'm sorry.
So how did you end up becoming a poet? How did that happen? And do you connect it with your jiu-jitsu journey, or is it something that stands on its own?
It was kind of coincidence. I found poetry around the same time I found jiu-jitsu. It was something that I found really helped me like regulate in one direction or the other, whereas jiu-jitsu was definitely a place where I almost couldn't tap into emotion as much when I was at jiu-jitsu, because I found that like if things were more erratic, if I wasn't in control of my emotions, I was going to lose, or I was going to like be more frustrated with the training. So I had to kind of like calm myself and rein myself in. And then having poetry along that same time, which I fell into by accident. I think I had hated poetry all throughout high school, and found a podcast actually that kind of got me into poetry through a different avenue. And and it ended up being something where I could take all this emotion that I couldn't tap into during jiu-jitsu, and I could actually still go to it later and be introspective and start to process through so many things that I didn't really have access to outside of that space. I found both of these around the time I had left high school, and I was kind of like dabbling in college, and I realized it wasn't for me, and so I stepped away from school. And that was where I had found jiu-jitsu, and I just kind of stumbled into a random gym, and started going in there, uh, and then poetry was something I took up just by myself. I didn't have school for it, and so I just kind of like pursued it through interest. And that was kind of like the spark for both of those things, and that's where I think they initially aligned, because it was just something I would swing from one to the other every couple months. I would just kind of like really focus in on one, and then I would really focus in on the other. The interesting thing now, and particularly with having switched to standard jiu-jitsu, is that with the constraints-led approach, um, and finding how I learned through that, I've been able to take a lot of those frameworks, a lot of those methods, and begin to apply it to my writing. And it's helped for a better balance, I think, and a more intentional approach to learning both, which for me is always extremely interesting. I've always been interested in learning, and so it was an incredible opportunity to be able to be like, oh, like this isn't just something to be able to learn how to pass guard or how to play guard or how to apply submission. This is a learning framework. This is something I can take and apply to whatever I would like to, as long as I have the proper approach to it.
Do you use constraints also when it comes to your poetry?
Absolutely. Which it was really interesting. It forced me to take a step back from everything I knew about the subject, which again, I went into it, kind of by my own path. This wasn't an academic path. I didn't go through it through a Master's of Fine Arts or anything. This wasn't, it was a very different way of going about this path that many people take when they do enter poetry. And so it forced me to kind of, I think, be honest with myself about what I know and what I don't know about poetry, and then instead focus on my experience of it. And I think it was really cool to kind of learn, what can I constrain when I take things to the page? What can how can I maneuver practice design in something as abstract as poetry? Because that was my initial question. You know what I mean? I think I saw the benefits of, what happened when I applied this to my jiu-jitsu training, and what happens when I, approach problem solving within that finite space of being on the mats. And then again, taking that framework and being like, what happens when it's something as open as poetry, and something as like, where anytime you set a rule, there's someone who can break that rule. And so like, it became a really interesting challenge, became a really interesting thought experiment for a while. And then it was something I settled down to begin to practice. And so I paired up with an incredible writer friend of mine, Silas Denver Melvin, he's a wonderful friend, and we sat down and together we would like get on the phone twice a week. I think 8 a.m. I would call, and we would be like, okay, this is what we're gonna do. We have an hour. We set a time, and we pretty much run it. We were running it like it was pretty like you came into standard. You know what I mean? And so like the same way we would set those times, set the constraints, set the task, and everything, it was very much mirroring that. And it was interesting to see. I mean, not all of it ends in a poem necessarily. I think there's this like misunderstanding where people will sometimes come to uh, uh, a practice and be like, I have to end up with something good. I have to end up with something meaningful. And it's no, we're practicing the skill of becoming a better writer, of becoming a better poet, of becoming a more intentional writer. And so I don't know, it was really interesting for me.
Can you give an example, like how you use constraint with writing? Like that really had impact on you when it came to poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, there's a several different ways you can kind of go about it. I think I'm usually hesitant to give like concrete examples sometimes, because like uh, just seeing how people respond to CLA in this, since it came out of the jiu-jitsu space, it's always made me nervous and be like, oh, I know this is going to sound ridiculous from a poetry perspective. But it is something that, like, again, I kind of like fumbled through and eventually came to. Some of the ways we can do this, and the way I like to really approach it is through space on the page, um, where, we're setting a task, something as simple as like, creating an image. Um, and you give the poet time, and I'm going to give you 4 lines. And within those 4 lines, you get to, and we can set the specifics depending on the writer, depending on what they're trying to write. Are we constructing a poem, or are we, taking a more prose approach? And so this is where, like, since beginning this process, I've focused more on working like one-on-one with writers so that we can kind of hone in on what it is they're trying to actually improve. Um, and that's when those constraints will really come alive, because then it's just like, okay, you know, are we going to use language as a constraint? Are we going to use, say, the syntax in the sentence structure as a constraint? How to structure the sentence, how to, I like space because it leaves it open, and it allows the writer to really make a lot of those decisions about how they want to format their poem, format their ideas, how they want to execute a particular idea. And I've noticed that taking that step back and being a little bit less specific about what I'm looking for will usually allow writers to create something that they genuinely feel strong about. The funny thing also is with these constraints is it's never just the one task. It's been extremely interesting to watch what happens over the course of an hour, right? Where the constraints that I have at the beginning of that lesson are going to it's going to be how can I say this? The constraints that I begin with will usually like have something to do with the following constraints in the following tasks, and usually what ends up happening is it will get very constrained, and then you will have an open session at the very end. And it's very much mirrored in this idea of playing the whole space in jiu-jitsu, um, which, we will look at guard passing, we'll look at pins, we'll look at, finishing submissions, like maybe we'll like approach this from a really constrained space. And then at the very end, we'll do a full roll. That was very much the idea that I had behind that. And so like, I'll start with some, open kind of more open approach to these constraints within language or the space of the poem or whatever. And then as the class continues, we'll kind of get more and more constrained until it's difficult. I want it to be difficult. And then we keep those same tasks, and at the very end, the only task is to present the poem. And what I love about that is that you truly have freedom when you approach it there. You can take those same ideas that you may have been struggling with, and suddenly that poem can be a single word, it can be a single sentence, it can be a couple sentences, it can be, there's so much space for what that poem could be if you wanted it to. And it's really just comes out in execution. And it's been a really interesting thing to see kind of the relationship of how constrained can something get, and then the slingshot effect that happens afterwards, right?
Absolutely. I just gonna just now save my dog from the couch, and then I have
Of
something to say
course.
about it. But I have to save her
Of
for a
course.
second.
Do you think?
Now she looks at me insulted. But I'll just give her something, then she probably will feel less insulted. Yeah, so when you were talking about the constraints of helping with writing, my husband, when he was writing copy, he was like, I need constraints because otherwise it's too open. Because
Mhm.
copy is not per se, like, writing is difficult, right? There's a reason why there are copywriters where it's, as with everything, it's a real skill. So he just used the format of a haiku because he had then to be precise, he had to be short, and the words, you don't have many words. And then he really came up with some very funny things. And yes, we could
Yeah.
alter it later a little bit if we felt that we needed some more sense. Oh yeah, Yuki's making a spectacle because she's now digging to show her displeasure. And I found that very interesting. And the idea came
Yeah.
from this book from David Epstein about how
Hmm.
constraints actually help us be more creative and help us
Right.
learn quicker. And
Right.
he himself said that as he was writing this book, he also gave himself constraints to kind of practice what he preaches as he was writing the book
Hmm.
about constraints. And I also really
Hmm.
like that. And indeed, my husband noticed that he was using different words. It was more precise. It was more like to the point. You kind of got rid of a lot of
Hmm.
fluff. And
Yeah.
also the whole process of was like quicker. And I remember when I was writing my masterpiece, but also my PhD, I usually had this rule that I had to write every day a minimum of 300 words. If I could not find, if I would have written the 300 and I had just, I really had to press them out because I had just no flow, whatever, then it was also okay. When I reached the 300, I could do something else. But typically, moments that you reached the 300, you usually got into a flow and then you kind of could continue and things were typically fine. So that was really a constraint that helped so much by making sure I had progress every day. And if there was a day where I couldn't get more out of it, then you didn't feel bad because you knew you did something. So that's actually
Of
as far
course.
as writing that I think now back, I'm like, oh, actually, that was a constraint too.
Yeah. It's interesting to see. This was something that fascinated me when I started like looking into this. Essentially to see if anyone else was also doing this or anyone else was also already, looking at an approach like this. Um, and part of it is that constraints do already exist within writing, and that is within form. That is, like you mentioned, haiku is a very prominent type of constraint in jujitsu, and in jujitsu, I'm sorry, in poetry. Um, And the same goes for other forms that people know traditionally, right? Sonnets. You think of villanelles. You think of whatever form people typically take. For me, it was interesting to kind of just like, okay, it's great that these are here, but I want to approach this from kind of like a blank slate. And it was less trying to kind of mold the way I was approaching writing into these forms and more just like how do these forms come about later? How do these forms come about on their own? Which later, I think it was really interesting to, again, you were talking about where are you able to apply constraints? And one of those things is sound. One of those things is in meter or pulse, right? And so it was interesting doing away with like everything that was already established in academia, and being like, I want to start completely on this completely blank slate, knowing nothing, and just kind of see where things go. It was cool to really come full circle and see like, okay, these are why these rhetorical devices are in place. These are why these literary
Mm-hmm.
devices are taught this way. Because what was most frustrating about being a poet was that anytime I wanted to look up how to get better at poetry, it was always the same recommendations. The first, which is the most important, I think is correct. Read. Great. What if you've already done that? How do you actually get better at poetry? And then it
Mm-hmm.
was like, try these forms, which is fine. This is good, but it's also, that's not how I'm going to get better. This is me just creating a specific under those specific constraints, and I don't understand what exactly I'm practicing, or maybe what it is I'm trying to fulfill within the intention of creating that poem, correct? And so understanding the impact of having proper intent as you're approaching these things then helped me understand, okay, what are the actual skills that apply in writing? One of those is keeping someone on the page, keeping someone to reading your writing. One of those is, like a hook, essentially, right? How do you get someone to stay on that page and read through everything you've done? How do you keep someone interested in what you're doing, which can happen through voice, can happen through the tone you convey, can happen through the imagery you're able to. So there are multiple ways to go about this, but ultimately we're honing in on the skill. Ultimately, we're honing in on like getting better at like what's actually being communicated. Um, and it was a humbling experience the whole way through because it was just like, oh wow, I'm really bad at this. And then it was just like, okay, cool. How do I get better?
Yeah, I think with everything is it, and I think especially with language, man. I think on the one hand we need language for communication, but on the other hand it's also massively limited. But within that
Hmm.
limitation of communication for written word, as you say, we can create images that people can, you describe something, you see it. I mean, you read a book, somehow you're somewhere else, right?
Hmm.
You're
Hmm.
when they describe where they are at, you're there. And I think that's so magical about words and poems can indeed, like, sometimes when I read one, I just get goosebumps, even though it's in the end of the day just like printed on a piece of paper, right? But we can somehow
Right.
move with that, and I think that is just very special. So have you, just out of curiosity, have you also looked at poems like from antiquity, Middle Ages? Have you just looked at different types there, and did you also learn things from the ancients and the medieval ones, or rather more modern poets?
I have, at least my approach right now, has always been a little bit more focused on contemporary poets, mostly because I want to focus on poets who are alive right now. Um, and but again, because I wanted to approach this honestly, and because I wanted to approach like I had to answer questions as to like what constitutes a poem, what what has already been established as poetry, and what can be perceived as poetry, and all this like kind of like came into the huge question, and it forced me to zoom out, and it forced me to zoom out on just the things that I like to focus on as poems and my experience of poetry, and then it forced me to look at like what has been considered poetry over the years, which in many ways like was plays, is spoken word poetry, is a lot of like oral tradition across several different cultures, right? And how all of these things were where rhyme became a mnemonic device, to be able to to remember, and then speak about stories and folklore and all of these things. Um, as for poetry that existed in the Middle Ages specifically, I haven't looked into those things. But again, zooming out has allowed me to now like look at different time periods and look at different writings from all over the world, and kind of like look at it through this fresh lens of just like, oh, what are they doing? What is this like mimicking? How are they approaching writing, and how are they achieving the same things that effective writers do today through whatever methods they're choosing? You know what I mean? And so, um, yeah, I think it is fascinating.
Is there like a current trend amongst contemporary poets, or is it still very like any style?
I think it depends, and it depends on where you're looking. Again, when I kind of set about doing this work of like um, trying to define what poetry is, I had to kind of like be honest with myself about these kind of like different like subsets of poetry, where there is what you would consider like, I guess, academic poetry, published poetry, poetry that is established as canon, poetry that is, within the system of poetry, within the institution of poetry, right? And then there's the poetry that exists outside of that, which is poetry that is read by and for different communities, and there is like poems that maybe don't necessarily fit in the academic space, by definition of that institution, but that are still,
Hmm.
again, poetic, and that are still, applying a lot of these skills of being a great writer or being a great orator. And how there is a disconnect between a lot of those different subsets for many different reasons, right? A lot of it is because a lot of these exist in marginalized communities that aren't going to get that same attention from a
Hmm.
typical, academic institution. Um, I think it, as opposed to there being a great trend, it was more just what is it that constitutes an effective writer, and what I noticed is that I think when you start thinking about like impact, and when you start thinking about effect, and you start thinking about what stays with a reader, or whoever experiences the poem, that's where we start getting into emotion. And so as that starts getting into a completely different side of this experience of poetry that we don't really talk about in terms of skill. I think we approach it in a way that's very I think we are trying to be very specific in the ways that we um, accomplish that sometimes, where we are trying to capture a specific tone or we are trying to convey a specific emotion. When the experience of emotion is going to be completely personal, it's going to be completely subjective. It's going to depend on the context the reader has. It's going to depend on their experience of the world and of that poem and the time at which they come across that poem. And so, because of these like different factors, what stood out to me was what is it that conveys oh, I'm sorry. What is it that impacts readers? What is it that stays with readers? What is it that keeps someone coming back to a poem when you like could have read a poem, you know, 20, 30 years ago and still remember it to this day and remember maybe not remember the poem exactly, but remember, oh, this shifted something in me. I remember feeling changed or some sort of effect from this poem. And so it was more interesting to see that is something that's happening in all of these different poetry spaces, whether it is Shakespeare's theater, or whether it is a particular monologue, or whether it is a poem on a page, or a poem that's published by a literary magazine, or whether it is something that's spoken at an open word mic down the road, you know, at a public library. You know what I mean? There is a moment where an emotion shifts, and we remember that shift. So it's kind of this is what was fascinating to me at first is that there's this movement in emotion that we don't acknowledge, and that's what I'm trying to train sometimes, and that's why I approach this as like with the constraints-led approach specifically, because with the constraints-led approach, we are thinking about movement within a space in poetry, and like I've been thinking about this term, like poetic space, right? You know, what happens within the space that we create with language, that we create on the page, or that we create when we are speaking a poem. And how do we move within that? How do we take our reader from one place into another? Maybe not with the specifics of I'm going to start off with a happy poem and make it a sad poem. No, not necessarily. But there is going to be a dynamic shift within the emotion of the poem. That to me is interesting. And that to me is something that I think can be practiced. And that is where I think a lot of the effectiveness will lie within however you approach poetry.
I love that. Actually, when you said like some poem when they move you, you remember them. And actually, me being an ancient historian, as a child, I was very into ancient Egypt and
Yeah.
was reading a lot about it. And I did come across this one poem, and I still know it to this day. Obviously, I would have to translate it into English, but in English, it goes like this. It's actually, it was like found in a tomb, and it was about a dancer. So she said, so it goes, the sound, the sound of your voice is sweet, full like the taste of date wine. And I, a drunken girl who is surrounded by flowers, lives as a prisoner to hear it.
Goodness.
And I was very young. I
Yeah.
has at that age, what was I, 6, 7? And like, what
Yeah.
do I know about being drunk or all that? Like, I didn't experience these things. And yet,
Right.
something about that poem moved me already then as a child. And even now, I'm what, 36, almost like, yeah, almost 20 years later, I can still recite it to you.
Yeah. Right. And this is the that is effective writing. That right. You know, for it to not only outstand centuries, but just have a particular effect on one person that they can remember so many years later. You know what I mean? It's fascinating. You know, 100% agree. And I've had this is I think what got me into poetry in the first place, where my entry point into poetry, like I said, was a podcast, and ended up being all these living contemporary poets, poets who were um, uh, just living their lives in New York, working other jobs, and you know, existing within a community of other poets and organizing with grassroots organizations, and you know, talking about you know all the things we were going through politically at the time. And so it was a very real space to kind of like enter as a new poet. And there were all these poems that they were excited by and showing and posting on social media. And for me, as a you know I was new to this, and so I was like saving all of these little poems, all these little fragments of writing, and those became eventually like pathways I would take into more um, poems that existed in the canon or poems that um, yeah, I would eventually find and love on my own and have my own little like personal library of just like, oh, this is the poem I always think of. This is a poem I will always refer someone back to. This is a poem I will always send somebody who is special to me, or this is a poem I will always refer to. You know what I mean? And so like, I just have this little backlog of just like things I can always send someone off my head. And I think it speaks to again what poetry is for us as humans, and it's this tool of expression. And that, yeah, I don't know. For me, it's fascinating.
Have you? I saw some months ago. I think it's called the Dead Poet Society. It's like an
Hmm.
older movie. I think from the 90s. Do you
Yeah,
know it?
fantastic movie. Yeah, broke my
And
heart.
what I liked
Absolutely
about
loved it. Yeah,
yeah, I yeah, because what I liked about it is like how the teacher helps them to think more critically um about through poetry. I mean, of course, they have like
right.
this main book that defines what poetry is, and they immediately like tear the that page out because
Yeah,
poetry cannot be defined in a way.
right,
So
right,
that I liked, but I just loved how indeed they started to think critically, and that
right.
poetry in so many ways, as you say, they can have so many uses. One can argue whether poetry needs to have a purpose, but also it can be so rebellious, and
Right.
that was really an aspect of it that I liked very much, because it can be very
Yeah,
bold. It can be so I really loved that movie, and it really made me think also differently about poetry, as I haven't necessarily pursued it myself much, but it really, I was like, oh, I like that, and I like reading it, and yeah,
yeah.
it's just something that
I
popped
think
up.
it's yeah, absolutely. First of all, I love that movie. I can't let myself watch it too often, but it's definitely one of my favorites. Um,
Mhm.
but I truly resonate with like this idea of like every time you set a rule for a poem, there is some poet out there who's going to break that rule, and they're going to write an even more
Mhm.
effective poem having broken that rule. And this was what was so challenging about initially starting this is that like I had to answer this question of what is a poem, which eventually when I did zoom out for me, the answer I had to settle for was what is presented as a poem. What has the poet, brought to the reader? Um, One of my favorite quotes that stays with me when I think about this is from Sarah Kay, who is a fantastic spoken word poet, who is just, I mean, yeah, is just absolutely incredible. Her poems like stay with me always. And she, I think in a different podcast was saying that like, what is the poet holding up to the light? And that for me, yeah, again, it's this idea of like, what do we want the reader to focus in on? What is being presented? What are the images that are present? How is the poet saying this? All of those things can, fall into like more of this process of just like, how are you doing this thing over what does this thing specifically mean? Um, and that focusing on process, that focusing on yeah, again, just like this journey through the page, as opposed to just this like final product of this is the poem, you know? That I think was what made it, I think, more or less daunting and more approachable as a practice. And I think this was my biggest thing is that like I wanted to be able to practice poems the same way I practiced jujitsu. And for many years that wasn't the case. For many years, for me, it was yes, I would have a really disciplined jujitsu practice, and I would go home and I would want to write some poems, and I would set up on my laptop, put something on TV that I didn't really care about, and I would wait for inspiration to hit me, and there was nothing that would happen. You know what I mean? Like maybe I would like crank out a few
Mhm.
things. Maybe I would like revisit a few old poems, or I would like try to work through things I've been working on for several months, and I didn't really have anything that I was really generating from there. Versus now, it's been nice to be able to like sit down and actually have a process and an intentional way of going from I have an idea and I want to execute it, or I don't have an idea, but I have some things that could begin to generate some fragments that I can later piece together or that I can later sit through edits with. Um, so yeah,
Do you give yourself time constraints?
yes. This for me is extremely important. I struggle with focus and I struggle with time blindness. And so for me, I have to be super intentional about I'm going to set this hour. I'm going to, set a timer and I'm just going to do this because if I sit down and I'm like, oh, I'm going to write for an hour, that's too much for me. I'm not going to do that. But if I sit down and I'm like, okay, I'm going to write, I'm going to warm up, kind of not warm up, but like kind of just like, fill the page for however many minutes. And I'm going to do another section of like 5 minutes, or I'm going to do another section of this goes extremely quickly. And then at the very end, I have maybe 15 minutes where I can just like write something for myself. And that was extremely helpful for me because now it's just like, okay, now I can sit with someone else and an hour of their time isn't going to be, maybe too daunting for them as a newer writer. And we can break it up into these fragments.
Mm-hmm.
So it became more digestible of a process for me through time constraints. There are some writers who do not like that, and this is kind of more of a personal approach. So I've worked one on one with some folks who are I'm like, okay, we're gonna break this up into two sections versus other poets where I'm gonna be like, okay, we're gonna do these smaller fragments and eventually expand outwards. And then there's some poets where I'm just like, okay, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about process. We're going to talk about what we're trying to accomplish in writing, and then I'm going to give you a week. Do you know what I mean? And so it's like it's that is less rigid for me, and it helps me focus more on what the writer I'm working with needs. Um, so yeah, it depends on the writer.
How is the community of poets? Because I don't, there's like a jiu-jitsu community. How is that? How do you find actually your people? Like, is it big? Is there a lot going on? Are there many events? How is that?
Yeah, it's no, it's extremely interesting. At least from what I've done, it's been more just locally and like through friends and people I interact with every day, people who I train with. Actually, a lot of the writers I speak to, I've met in the training room and we've spoken about writing and we've done one-on-one sessions there. And for me, it's always fascinating. I've done very few events because, again, it's something I'm newer to and coming from maybe a different perspective from a lot of folks. But I did have the opportunity to read at the Wild and Precious Life series uh, once earlier this year and once last year as well for Pride Month, and it was a fantastic opportunity. And I got to meet a lot of writers through there. And typically, I mean, what I've noticed there and at other workshops I've done in the past and other reading events I've done in the past, um, they're always super supportive. Everyone is always like extremely welcoming and inviting and open to these different approaches to writing and everything like that. And so it's been super fun. And it's a extremely rewarding community. And just, I mean, everyone has this uh, just such an amazing perspective that they can bring just through all these different walks of life, and that's something that like I think brings me a lot of joy and a lot of hope. Uh, because it doesn't matter what your life experience has been, you've had something that has impacted you, and you have something that you can probably speak on from a perspective that most other people can't see. And uh, that already brings such an important gravity to someone's writing, where it's anchoring to the personal. Um, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating.
Do you think that, or do you feel that being so busy with poetry, did it affect also jiu-jitsu? Like, did it also go back? Did it
At first,
transfer back somehow?
at first, I think so. At first, because at first it felt like this pendulum. At first, I would focus in on jujitsu for 3 months, and then I'd get really burnt out, and so then I would focus on poetry as a result. And so it was this like swinging back and forth. Versus now, uh, and particularly when I got back to standard, when I found standard in like 2021. That was when I kind of like started shifting things. That was when I started changing my approach to writing. That was when I started changing my approach to how I learned pretty much everything. Um, because it was just such a concrete example of what can happen when I am deliberate about what I'm focusing on. And I think it's been something that, like, yes, absolutely, it's one has affected the other in ways that I wish I could describe in even more detail, because, like, for me, I think it forced me to take a step back from how I was approaching training. It was this really interesting dynamic of there were several conversations that were happening when CLA was initially being critiqued about um, how CLA is ineffective for beginners, or how CLA is more effective because you have prior training or whatever. And I was um, going into this process of learning CLA as a purple belt. And for me, it was like, okay, I already had this experience, I already had all this training, I already had these systems that I was developing and what I thought I was good at. And there were two things that happened. One, being at Standard completely humbled me and completely, like, made me realize I didn't know anything, uh, which is an incredible experience. I mean, for me, it was just like, oh, like, I don't know what I've been doing this entire time. But B, it also
Mm-hmm.
forced me to be honest about what patterns was I defaulting to, what decisions was I making ahead of time as opposed to focusing on the task and breaking away from whatever prior decisions I had made about my game, you know? And so when I started applying this into the poetic space, it was different, right? You know, because it allowed me to see the freedom I really had and how to approach these different tasks. And then when would go back to training, I'd be like, okay, well, maybe I'm thinking about this too rigidly. Um, what if, yeah, what if I did the crazy thing and actually tried this as it's meant to be tried, and kind of like let go of these preconceived notions of what I had about my game. And essentially, yeah, one ended up helping the other, for me, it exists as that relationship. I can't separate one from the other now, which is, yeah, again, something I'm always super excited to talk about. I know my friends make fun of me because I will never shut up about this, but for me, it's always they're two of my favorite things, and for them to exist parallel to each other for me is always the greatest thing.
Mm. So, as we come to close, two things.
Yeah.
One, personal question, whether you would like to share some poetry of yours, and if not, totally fine, of course. And the second question or thing would be, what would you tell beginning poets, people that would like to play around with poetry?
Yeah. I I'm gonna start with the second question as I'm, like, pulling up a poem here.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Sure.
I what's it called? For newer writers, a couple things. One, I think everyone is scared to be wrong. Everyone is scared to be judged. Everyone is scared to write the bad poem. Um, what I think was really healing for me as a writer was that the first year that I started applying this, um, there was no focus on editing at first. There was no focus on finishing the poem. It was just get something out, finish the task. And then when I do have an idea I want to expand on, great, I can take that through edits. I can run that through other people. I can, get feedback on that. Fantastic. And so it forced me to step away and be able to fail forward and be able to, what's it called? I don't know, just be more intentional about finishing poems as opposed to finishing a perfect poem. And for that, for me, that was extremely important. Yeah, let me see here. As for the other, there is a poem I really want to read. One second here. Okay. Okay. So this is one of the very first poems I started writing with applying the constraints-led approach. This was from a prompt, which is from one of the very first that I did with Silas, um, and we had started talking about bird watching, and this was kind of an experience of like, again, writing kind of what's in front of you. This was the time when I was living in a very small room And I had this one little window that my cats would always love, and we would always just kind of like watch the birds together. And uh, for me, I think what we were focusing in on was just, again, what are we perceiving within the space? What is our experience of the space? What are we bringing into the poem? What are we holding up to the light? And for me, it was fun to kind of start to play with this idea. And so this is, how did you get into bird watching? How did you get into bird watching? I wake up covered in moss. I found 3 envelopes next to my morning cup of coffee. Instant. I don't need it to be very strong. I struggle writing things with clarity. Sometimes, even if I can understand them, I do not know what they say. I sit in front of a trapdoor opening, a whistling fall where everything disappears into nothingness, and I keep the void of the poem in my pocket. I water it every morning, and we listen to the neighborhood birds. I pick up a book that names them. My cat chatters and clicks and tries to let me decipher it. My errands are covered in feathers. I become an owl before I can finish the poem, before I can finish my coffee, still half asleep and trying to make sense of things. And I owe too much money to stop working. And in the same breath, nothing will ever be enough. Nothing will ever be enough. Nothing will ever be enough. And I wake up covered in the morning. I open 3 envelopes with a to-do list in the first, a reminder to write a poem on the second, and a blank page to send out on the third. I wish I would have known to be prepared with a poem. I would have probably had something a little bit more relevant, but I think this was fun because this was an early example of what
No, I like
I was exploring when attempting this, right?
No, I like it very much. What really resonated a bit was that you write things that you kind of cognitively understand it, but also not. That is something that I felt that one. No, I don't know,
Thank you.
poems are just different from books. I don't know. I think
Mm,
it's really somehow a magical space. Because indeed, I listen to this and I can just see it, feel it. And I don't know. I find somehow poems, they just indeed have can have so much emotional impact with just a few sentences. I mean, books
yeah,
can have too. They can bring you in a whole different world and like all that. But poems are typically shorter, way
yeah,
shorter. Um, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing this one.
of course. It's again my favorite thing in the world to talk about, and it's been such a rewarding experience to take everything that has impacted me in jiu-jitsu and has impacted me in a space and community that was as tough but as rewarding as that community, and to bring it into something else I also love, which is this idea of language and this idea of being able to communicate these extremely human emotions of wonder, of love, of fascination, of despair sometimes, and all of these things that we're always trying to communicate as humans. We're always trying to express. And for me to have a pathway between the two, it's everything.
That's everything. I think it's very special. And indeed, to have a way to express yourself. Some do it through art, others through music, and some also through words. So I think that's just something maybe unique to humans that I think is just so beautiful.
Right. You see a lot of the same expression
So then,
in jiu-jitsu too. Um,
mhm.
right? In the
Mhm.
ways that people grapple, in the ways that people pass, in the ways that people apply their submissions. There's a very specific signature to how people approach it and how people accomplish these things. That again, for me, was always fascinating. That was one of I had a training partner that would always talk about the poetry of jujitsu is in the movement of it, and for me, that was something that
Mhm.
stuck with me and was probably why later I ended up trying to like link the two. But um, yeah, it's always going to be unique to the practitioner. It's always going to be unique to the writer.
I love that sentence that the poetry is in the movement. That is so beautiful. Thank you, Saul. Do you have any other things that you're like, I did not say it, but I have to say it until we end this
Yeah,
podcast episode?
just one last thing, because I am um, a trans practitioner of jujitsu. and a trans writer, right now it's extremely important for me to kind of speak to this idea of the Supreme Court ruling that happened yesterday, as for speaking about banning trans girls from competing in sport in their academic spaces, um, and how this is a devastating blow to our community, but that these spaces, these whether jujitsu spaces, sports spaces, all of these things are for me, it's so important to just have people in those spaces and have welcoming spaces for them, and to be able to like kind of bring everybody together. And for me, this is such a devastating blow. And so I did want to bring that into awareness, because for me, as a trans woman existing in these spaces, it's again not something I can separate from it, right? We exist in this reality right now that uh, doesn't see myself and every other, trans girl as someone who is worthy of being in this space for one reason or another. When I train with Queer Fight Club here in the DMV, and I am one of the volunteer instructors, and we have a community of amazing queer and trans folks who are will step on the mats and who will give it their all, and who learn just as well and just as efficiently and train just as hard. And we will, compete in our own spaces. And maybe this isn't like a school academic space, which, my heart goes out to all of the trans kids, who are affected by this ruling there, and how this, unfortunately, um, does not make unfortunately doesn't make the safer, for anybody. For people who even don't fall under that identity are now going to be subjected to a different level of scrutiny that is, extreme, again, devastating. And for me, it was really important to speak to that. Yeah, my heart goes out to them.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't aware that there was this ruling only yesterday, because I did see you
Mhm.
also competed. Did you
Yes.
encounter issues before? How did that go? Like, did you
Yeah.
find it was difficult? Was it well accepted?
Well, it was. I think a lot of it for me was a mental barrier. A lot of it for me, particularly at whatever gym I was at, I was always like, I have to prove myself as a good grappler, and then maybe I can allow myself to exist fully in the space in my identity. Um, and then bringing that to competition was a whole nother level um, of anxieties, right? Because um, that was just always in the back of my mind. And so I couldn't focus on the fight because I was so focused on all of these other anxieties. And, I think also like I was less skilled, and I was less, still coming up and still learning the ropes and everything. But it was a very different anxiety when I started competing in the queer and trans circuit, which is, exploded over the past couple of years, where now we're having events in Seattle, we're having events in New York, we're having events in, we have people flying in to the DMV from Tennessee, from all over. And it's fascinating because this entire block of anxiety that I used to have to deal with, on top of all the competition anxiety already, kind of just wasn't there. All of a sudden, I could just exist in that space and compete in a way that I felt proud of. And for me, it became really
Hmm.
important to represent the type of jujitsu that we do at. Sorry, my cat wants to say hi. The type of jujitsu that we do at Standard, and being in queer and trans circles for me was like important to exemplify that, like, no, we can do this. We can absolutely apply this, and we can be, strong practitioners of this sport. And yeah, it's something I'm really proud of. I'm extremely proud to be in that space, and much love to all the queer and trans circles out all over the country who are building these spaces for folks in our communities, who are, at the forefront of a lot of this hostility and a lot of this insecurity coming from communities that we know when we're in that room. And if you don't know our identity, you're just training with us, and we're in there to take everyone's head off.
Yes.
Everyone's the same. And so
Yep.
I'm open about it now because I have done that work to feel confident in it, and I know that no one can take that away from me. But that's not the case for everybody, and everyone is at a different place in their journey. And so I think the best thing we can do is, be open and support. And um, I know that's a lot to ask, but for me, that's where we start. Hey, we're going to be here regardless, so we might as well train together, and we may as well figure things out. A lot of those conversations
Yeah, because
will happen regardless, right?
yeah, I mean, I had it was a few years ago. I went to a ladies' camp in Texas, and there was a
Yeah.
trans lady, and there was another person who was like, "Yeah, Lorraine, you're always like so busy with inclusivity and stuff, and like, what is your opinion about it?" And I'm like, "My opinion about what?"
Right.
Like she's
Right.
there.
Yeah.
For
End of the
me, I was like,
conversation.
"Why do I have to have?" Yes, I was like, "Why do I have to have?" And then they were like, "Yeah, yeah, okay, so maybe it makes sense to train with them, a bit this othering, them, which already kind of triggered me, but okay.
Hmm.
But okay, with the camp, she kind of understood, but then she was like, yeah, but what about competition? Because it's always about competition, right? When the
Hmm.
conversation goes in jiu-jitsu, it's usually always about this competition thing. And then I said to her, like, have you, like, because she's like, yeah, because what if they have, um, advantages, and it's always the conversation is always in that space somehow. And then
Right.
I asked her, I was like, do you have a problem with competing against, say, biological women, um, that are using sports enhancing drugs? Because she was like going on this thing, what if? So I said, for the sake of the argument,
Right.
if it would be true that trans folks would actually have an advantage, let's say that for the sake of the argument that that would be true, then you should also have an issue with biological women fighting with them that are using sports enhancing, or like enhancing drugs. Then you should also
Right.
have an issue with that.
Right.
And then she's like, oh, yeah, I didn't think of that. Because I mean,
Right.
to me personally, I'm kind of like, if people are just cool, I train with you because I like training with many people. Like for me, that all that stuff is like, first of all, not necessarily none of my business. But if you just want to train, have fun, have a good attitude, then I'm like, hey, I'm here all for it. But for her, it was like really a big thing because she was thinking, I was like, no, I think at the Worlds, I have actually fought women that were using doping and stuff, and I don't know.
Yeah.
And then I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, but so see, so your argument, your fear, it doesn't really matter. Like you have
Right.
lost matches, won matches. Um, so that was actually the last conversation that I really had on this topic of somebody personally, because there was a trans person there.
Yeah.
And I was thinking that, but I just noticed that this makes people so uncomfortable, and I don't really see why, because they're just people
Precisely. I think
that just
that's what's
want to
most
enjoy the
frustrating.
sport.
That's what's most frustrating about it is there are so many conversations, discussions, there's so much discourse, and when the reality is, hey, I'm here and I'm on your mats and I'm looking for someone to train with. That's the end of it. I am another body. And the specifics of gender and the specifics of how I'm presenting and the specifics of all of these things, A, aren't really any of anyone's business, but also is going to be singular, is going to be unique from one person to another. Almost like, oh my goodness, every single other person on the mats, every single other man, every single other woman, every single other queer or trans person on the mats is going to have a singular, unique identity, a singular, unique life experience that they bring onto the mats. And everyone, again, everyone is going to be different. And so all these conversations that are happening when in reality, we just want to train. We just want to get better the same as anyone else does. And we want to be able to compete. And there are a lot of, yeah, there are a lot of places that I stepped away from competition in a big way because I knew this was just getting myself involved in a lot of processes that I knew was going to be a nightmare for me. And so I was just like, I'm not really trying to do that anymore. And so seeing the opportunity to do this in a community of queer and trans folks where we were building that own space, our own space for this essentially was suddenly very much just like, oh, this isn't even a conversation we have to have here. And that competition has been incredible. I found some of my like my current training partners, who I mean are incredible people and who really challenge me and who force me out of my shell in training, because they challenge me, and they are other, you know, just people who show up on the mats and who give me a hard time, and that's the end of it. It's always going to be a different body type, you know. It's not like we always train with someone who has the exact same, measurements as us. No, I mean it's always going to be different, and so we have to be able to problem solve. Yes, that is the entire point of this puzzle that is the grappling space, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting that people forget that once it's about identities, genders, that people just forget that by the end of the day, it's indeed about problem solving, getting better, all the other things. I think, especially on the mats, it's just it's not relevant because in the end, like respect all needs to be, but I mean, like it's not nobody else business whether somebody has, how do I
Right,
say this, because I also don't want to necessarily piss off people by using the wrong words because I know they are very precise, but I
of
really, I
course,
mean, please do correct because I do want to say it correctly, but same with like pronouns, this and that. Yeah, well, if people tell me, then I change it. I don't mind because if people feel comfortable that way, fine. It doesn't take anything away from me. Nothing.
precisely.
You know.
Right. We are
And
we are we are
there,
so. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry, yeah. I mean, there was one that we trans that we had, and we knew this person before, and sometimes because of German, the German language has like for words they can be male, female, and neutral, and
Hmm.
like it's not my mother tongue, so sometimes I would still make mistakes, and I would feel very bad for it, but it wasn't like on purpose because I wasn't trying, and I think it's okay for people to, especially when you know somebody, because you've know them also from a different space. So sometimes that's just like a bit that you just slip. But I think as long as it's clear that people are willing and they want to do the right thing, I think it's okay. Then you find this
Yeah.
common ground where it works. And I just don't see, like the same for me. If I ask somebody to do something or not to do something and people do it because it doesn't take anything away from them, why can we not do this for the trans folks either? I don't see there the issue. Like I just don't see it. So I am sorry for what you told me then yesterday that they passed this now. At least I'm happy that there are you guys are creating your own spaces, and it's good. It's clearly important because otherwise you cannot compete, kind of like it's you
Yeah.
have to. But at the same
Yeah.
time, I'm also like, this shouldn't not be necessary.
Right.
But who knows? I think sometimes I think that the trans community, it's just still too new for many Western cultures. Somehow it's too new and it still takes more time until it's like fully embedded. I don't know. Maybe that's me wishful thinking. I don't know. It's just like my hope. But I really hope
I
that in
th
the future that's not necessary. Not because
Right.
otherwise you wouldn't have opportunities.
Right. I think it's been more an issue of either like not being acknowledged if we know that we're going to enter a lot of hostility in these spaces, and there's less incentive for queer and trans folks to enter grappling spaces. There's less incentive for them to enter spaces where, yeah, we're going to be, subjecting ourselves to this level of essentially violence, right? And I mean, like when we look at how um, male dominated the jujitsu space is already, right? And a lot of the conversations around toxic masculinity, around safety for women, around safety for survivors within this space, then I mean it's a difficult these are difficult conversations we have to have, but it's also just like queer and trans people have always existed in these conversations, and also just like completely separate, and we're made the scapegoat of a lot of these conversations. When no, we already actually have a lot of predators in this space, and we have a lot of people who are doing harm in this space, and we can have those conversations if people are prepared to have those conversations. The issue is, I don't think that's where they are putting their focus on. Where yeah,
Yeah, I think that people don't want this integration yet. And
Yeah,
it is just, I think, because some people just as classic, they're afraid of that what they don't understand. It's
absolutely.
just this, or it doesn't. It's just it. Sometimes I'm kind of like, oh, Yuki just hits her head. Sometimes I'm also like, it's. I don't think it's that deep. It's always so. It's always the same. It's they're afraid. It's something that they don't understand, but then they also
Right,
don't really want to understand. Because I know
right.
quite a bunch of stories that once people got to know a bunch of trans folks, they're like, oh, they're actually really cool to hang around with.
Isn't
And
that
I'm like,
incredible? Yeah, yeah,
yeah, that I'm like, oh my god. And in the beginning it's like, they are then the exception, but then step by step they start to realize that, oh, actually they're also like us human. We all have to go to the toilet, we all have to, brush
hmm
teeth, go to bed, sleep, all this stuff. It's just in the end still the same. And for me, like, in our school, like, many schools say that, that everybody is welcome in their school, and I'm like, no, with me it's not. Because if people have an opinion on things that, how do I say this, that somehow impacts the existence of another,
right,
then I do not want these in my people in my space. Because if
right.
you want to say, oh, my space is open for everyone, that also
Yeah,
mean that people that actually mean harm to other populations would then also be welcome. And in my school, it's like, I want people that come to work, I want people that like just love for jiu-jitsu, have good attitude, mindset, and the politics, the all that I
hmm
don't want that on the mats. Having said so, when people would have displayed specific political views or things that, again, questions the existence of specific populations, then I'm like, I'm sorry, then my gym is not the right one for you.
right. And like it's that we can't separate ourselves from that political reality that impacts
Yeah,
us, right? Unfortunately, it's just we if we are going to have these honest conversations, we can have these honest conversations. Um, and ultimately, if we are there to train jujitsu, then we can be there to train jujitsu. But also, this is with respect for the people who show up. This is with an understanding that we are even within and I think I mentioned this another time with you in a previous conversation we had, is that the approaching jujitsu through this constraints-led approach kind of offsets this power, right? From just the coach to every practitioner. And it's why I love it for writers as well, because you can kind of take these same ideas and you can apply it in your own time. You can apply it in your own
yeah.
training, jiu-jitsu in a garage when you're, traveling with friends if you'd like. You know what I mean? And so it's kind of like, yeah, all these things exist in tandem and we do the best we can.
I think that's what makes COA also one of these topics that many traditional type of coaches hate, is that if you think about it, when you apply the constraints led approach, you don't need many names for techniques because
Hmm
there are not really any. So
Right.
coaches cannot be the expounders of truth anymore. They just
hmm
become more game designers than anything else. And I think that's something that they don't like because it actively destroys hierarchy. Obviously,
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
always some. And that's why I think constraint approach is hated so much, because you cannot be patted on the back like, oh man, you're so awesome, or this that. No, because from a coach centered room you go to a student centered room, and indeed, lo and behold, students have choice. Students practice self autonomy every class they have, because you have to, because that's just like
Exactly.
how you learn in an environment. And I think that is what threatens many traditional based coaches that like the hierarchy, that like the power imbalance, that want to somehow be on a pedestal. And so for me, I think apart from COA being such an effective method of training, of learning movement, any movement,
hmm
or even constraints in general when it comes to poetry, I also think
Right.
it actually destroys the establishment when it comes to hierarchies. And I think that that's also a very, very good thing.
Precisely. It highlights that practice design is also a skill. It highlights how well you know what you are practicing. Which again, if it is jujitsu, how well do you understand the grappling space? How well do you understand the interaction with one body with another body? And if it's in the writing space, it's how well do you understand the space of the poem. What are you trying to practice? What are you trying to accomplish? It forces you to be honest with yourself about these things. And so there's this dismantling of any preconceived notions we have about our knowledge of these space, or these gatekeepers of knowledge within, elite jiu-jitsu spaces or within elite poetry institutions. Like it's kind of, it offsets that power. And I think it allows people coming from, any number of, places within their lives, that it makes everything approachable, and it makes it accessible, and it makes it possible for someone who maybe is not considered within that space initially, for them to be able to show up and truly be a practitioner. You know what I mean? And regardless of
Yeah.
what they're practicing.
Yeah, well said. So yeah, essentially, it just gets out all the fluff so we can focus on what really matters.
Absolutely.
So thank you. So thank you, Saul. I really enjoyed. I learned a lot. I will definitely look into some more poetry stuff. And also thank you for addressing the law that they have now. It's important that it's addressed and talked about. So thank you for that as well, and for your openness. That's not easy, especially not in a world where indeed there is a lot of hostility. So thank you for that as well. It's very brave. And yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And wishing you a lovely day.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the time here on this podcast, and thank you for all the work you do as well. I think these conversations are extremely important to have, and thank you for facilitating these spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saul, for this conversation. It is a privilege to learn from you, and I'm so glad we got to meet face to face at Standard. I hope to train with you soon again. When we visit you all, your approach to poetry and driving force to talk about crucial topics such as laws limiting trans athletes is humbling, brave, and so much needed. Please know I stand with you. To my listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and it made you think about your own approach to life and other domains within your life where adding constraints unlock creative potential.